I think we can all agree that Susan Smith should never see the outside of a prison. It took 6 minutes for that car of hers to sink. The only person in the world that they felt should be protecting them had abandoned them to that cold, suffocating death. Swift justice for a man accused in the bludgeoning death of a Georgia nursing student out for a jog in broad daylight. Plus, trial continues for a Marine veteran at the center of a fatal New York subway chokehold incident. And 30 years after the drowning murder of her 2 children, a South Carolina woman stands before a parole board pleading for mercy. All this and more this week on Courtroom Confidential. We have verdicts and we have ongoing trials and we even have an overturned verdict. There's a lot to jump into as we record this on Thursday, November 21st, 2024. Let's get started. The Venezuelan man convicted of killing Georgia nursing student Laken Riley has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in a case that became a flashpoint in the national debate over immigration. On Wednesday, Athens Clarke County Superior Court Judge H. Patrick Haggard found Ibarra guilty soon after closing arguments were presented. Ibarra had waived his right to a jury trial, meaning Haggard alone heard and decided the case. Prosecutors argued Ibarra encountered Riley while she was running on the University of Georgia campus on February 22nd and killed her during a struggle and attempted sexual assault. Amongst other evidence, prosecutors highlighted how Ibarra's DNA was found under Riley's fingernails, and her DNA and Ibarra's were found on a jacket that police found in a trash bin in his apartment complex. A man seen in security footage throwing that jacket away was identified as Ibarra by his brother and another roommate. Riley's family and friends tearfully remembered her and asked Judge Haggard to sentence Ibarra to the maximum penalty. Her mother, Allison Phillips, said there is no end to the pain, suffering, and loss we have experienced and will continue to endure. She told the judge, "This sick, twisted, and evil coward showed no regard for Laken or human life. We're asking the same be done for him." All right, well, what's happening here? This case initially received a lot of attention for the political climate surrounding it. But when this trial played out, what really became important was the story of essentially every parent's worst nightmare. This was a young woman, successful, pursuing her dreams. Her family had set her up in all the ways that you would hope for your child. And she's doing something innocent, not living a high-risk lifestyle. She's out for a jog in the middle of the day. And all of a sudden, they don't hear from her anymore. And her mother starts to panic. And the text messages that were read in court that were sent from Laken's mother to her as Laken was likely already dead is some of the most chilling stuff I've heard. Not because of the words, but because you're realizing the growing panic and terror inside of that mother's mind. She says, "You're making me nervous not answering while you're out running. Are you okay? Please call me. I'm worried sick about you." It makes me think of all the times I've received similar text messages from my parents, worried phone calls. "Where are you? We're worried about you." Or all the text messages that thousands of parents across this country have sent to their children when there was nothing to worry about. And now that nightmare came true for this poor family. That is the part that I struggle with most about this case, is realizing the pain that they are going through. She was not living a high-risk lifestyle. She was not doing something that we would consider to be inviting this kind of violence. She was out for a jog in the middle of the day, and her life was brutally stolen from her. And I applaud the prosecutors for keeping that the point of this case, for keeping politics out of it, while the nation was watching, while the media was covering this, all with that same angle. The prosecutors in this case presented this case in a very straightforward and convincing way, because they realized that what this case really was about was the loss of an innocent person's life in a very brutal and violent way. But the question that I get asked most about this is, why was it a bench trial? And that was a strange decision. Bench trials are not unheard of, but usually they come up in only a few circumstances. This is where the defendant has waived their right, their constitutional right to have a jury trial, and they're asking instead for the judge to make the decision alone. Usually you see that in cases where you have a couple of combined circumstances. One, you may have very graphic and emotionally triggering facts and evidence like we did in this case. But then it's also where you have the defense attempting to make what may be a very nuanced legal argument. Their argument is not about the facts. Their argument isn't about alibi. Their argument isn't about opportunity. Their argument is about maybe something to do with the elements of the crime, some nuanced loophole that they're hoping to exploit or convince a person of. And they know that getting 12 non-lawyers to understand that might be difficult, but getting a judge who has been on the bench for decades, who understands the law, who understands the nuances of the law, maybe that judge will appreciate it, but that didn't happen here. The other instance where I can think of where this might be used, a bench trial, is when you have nothing else to lose. He was looking at life without parole. And I don't believe there was any entertaining of an offer coming from the prosecution in this case. First of all, realizing the national attention and then putting all of that aside, the incredible, brutal, senseless loss of life. Nothing short of life without parole, I imagine, had ever been discussed. So he's got nothing else to lose. And rather than take a plea, perhaps they thought there's this outside chance that if we put on a trial, something might happen. Might an error take place? Might a witness not show up? As slim as that might be, is it worth taking that chance? And at the same time, let's not waste the time and put on this circus of a jury trial. I don't know. If that is true, well, then I guess we can be thankful for very small blessings that we didn't have to suffer through all of this for weeks, but that we were able to see justice handed out in a very efficient manner in this case. But what do you guys think? This case to me was incredibly heartbreaking to think about. One, the struggle that this young woman put up in the final moments of her life. And then two, to realize that moment and when her parents realized their nightmare had come true. Please let us know your thoughts on this case in the comments. For 6 minutes, Jordan Neely was pinned to a subway floor in a chokehold that ended with him lying still. But that's not what killed him. A forensic pathologist testified Thursday in defense of the military-trained commuter charged with killing Neely. On May 1st, 2023, Neely entered a New York subway car shouting about being willing to die or go to jail and making sudden movements, according to witnesses. Marine veteran Daniel Penny told investigators that Neely then lunged towards a woman with a small child and shouted, "I will kill." Penny put his arm around Neely's neck, took him to the floor, and held Neely there, with Penny's legs around him, for close to 6 minutes, bystander videos show. Neely had stopped moving during roughly the last minute. Earlier in the trial, a New York City medical examiner testified for the prosecution that Daniel Penny's chokehold killed Neely. But the defense pathologist, Dr. Satish Chandra, told jurors that Neely's medical records and bystander video didn't show telltale signs of known types of fatal chokeholds. Among the discrepancies, he said, the location and extent of bruising on Neely's neck and the small amount of petechiae, small red spots caused by subsurface bleeding, on his eyelids. In your opinion, did Mr. Penny choke Mr. Neely to death? Defense lawyer Steve Razor asked. No, replied Chandra, who has worked as a medical examiner for county governments in Florida and Texas. Instead, the doctor testified that Neely died from, quote, the combined effects of synthetic marijuana, schizophrenia, his struggle and restraint, and a blood condition that can lead to fatal complications during exertion. Closing arguments are expected as early as this week. What is happening here? I have real problems with this case. Now, there is no question that this is a tragedy. There is no question that this man did not deserve to lose his life. But not all tragedies are crimes, and not all deaths are murder. The prosecution, just keep this in mind as I'm discussing this, the prosecution has conceded that Neely presented a threat. They have conceded that Penny did not intend to kill Neely. They have conceded that Penny was reasonable in responding to that threat by putting him into a quote unquote chokehold. But the prosecution says that he held on for too long, that the crime, that the manslaughter was committed in the 2 to 3 minutes that he held on too long. Now, my question to you is, how is Penny expected to know that? How is he expected, no medical training, to know at which point he is stepping from being a hero, quite frankly, protecting the other people on that train, to being a murderer, someone guilty of manslaughter? And what if, as this expert has said, other factors contributed to his death and not Penny alone? The point is this: it's not that prosecutors should not bring criminal charges in difficult cases. I think they should, and I applaud that. When you have a case based entirely on circumstantial evidence, when you have a no-body murder, when you have a cold case, when you have reluctant witnesses, cases of great complexity, I applaud their efforts to bring justice in those cases. But where intent and causation are so questionable, do we gamble with the life of this man who could end up in prison for 15 years? That's where I struggle. Prosecutors should be gatekeepers, even when that means declining to prosecute, when you may technically have the elements satisfying a crime, but you know that looking at it holistically with everything involved, it's probably not the right thing to do. But what do you guys think? What is your vote? From everything that you've heard up till now, do you think he's guilty or not? Should this case have been pursued or not? Let us know in the comments. A parole board decided unanimously Wednesday that Susan Smith should remain in prison, despite her plea that God has forgiven her for infamously killing her 2 young sons 30 years ago by rolling her car into a South Carolina lake while they were strapped in their car seats. It was the first parole hearing for Smith, who's now 53, who is serving a life sentence after a jury convicted her of murder but decided to spare her the death penalty. Smith made international headlines in 1994 when she insisted that a black carjacker drove away with her sons. For 9 days, Smith made numerous and sometimes tearful pleas asking that Michael and Alex be returned safely. The whole time, the boys were in Smith's car at the bottom of nearby John D. Long Lake. Prosecutors argued that Smith killed 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex because she believed they were the reason the wealthy son of the owner of the business where she worked broke off their affair. Her attorneys blamed her mental health. On Wednesday, Smith made her case to the South Carolina Parole Board by video link from prison. She started by saying that she was very sorry, then broke down in tears and bowed her head. Quote, "I know what I did was horrible," Smith said, pausing and then continuing with a wavering voice, "and I would give anything if I could go back and change it." Smith's ex-husband and the father of the boys, David Smith, also made a statement, struggling to get out words at first. Pausing several times to compose himself, he said he has never seen Susan Smith express remorse toward him, adding, "She changed my life for the rest of my life that night." Smith is eligible for parole hearing every 2 years now that she has spent 30 years behind bars. All right, what's happening here? I think we can all agree that Susan Smith should never see the outside of a prison. Prosecutors were able to determine that it took 6 minutes for that car of hers to sink. 6 minutes. Think about how long a period of time that is. Take a look at the clock right now. I'll continue to talk, and you see how long it takes for 6 minutes to go by. For 6 minutes, those little boys cried out for their mother. They were terrified. They even held hands together for 6 minutes as they continued to see that water rising, as that cold, cold water started to cover them. The only person in the world that they felt should be protecting them had abandoned them to that cold, suffocating death. There is no reason on earth that you can give to explain or excuse that to me. So why are we here in the first place? Why are we even talking about this woman 30 years later and the idea that there may be a chance that she gets out of prison? Here's something to understand. Originally, this was a death penalty case. That is what prosecutors were asking for back in 1994. But according to reports at the time, the jury chose life instead of death, believing that life in prison would be a greater punishment for this woman. They wanted her to live with it for the rest of their lives. They thought that somehow giving her the death penalty would be some sort of act of mercy in ending her life, that she wouldn't have to deal with the torture of living a life knowing that she had taken the lives of her two young boys. That apparently was the thinking behind the jurors back at that time. What they didn't know and didn't realize or understand was that life at that time in South Carolina did not mean without parole. In 1996, and many people say perhaps in response to this case, the law changed in South Carolina for life to mean the rest of a convicted person's life. The convicted person's entire life is what life would mean. But they couldn't go back and change this retroactively. They couldn't go back and change her sentence. She had been sentenced in 1994, convicted and sentenced to life, and the meaning that life had in South Carolina at that time, and that meant 30 years, and then you're eligible for parole. And I think this demonstrates a couple of things. One, juries often, despite instructions as many times as you give it to them, they are going to consider things outside of the law and outside of the instructions. They have biases, they have life experiences, they have anecdotal evidence. And even in this case, when they are trying or intending to do something that may be a worse punishment, they don't realize all the behind the scenes factors and nuance of the law, but they're considering something outside of what they should have been considering. Now, that was a reason given. Perhaps that was a reason that some felt they could hang their hat on to not decide death in this case, a highly watched case. I don't know. But I think the other thing it tells us is how it's interesting to look back at these cases with the passage of time, 30 years later. Culturally, how have we changed? Sometimes we change dramatically how we feel about a case. 30 years later, we're talking about the Menendez case, and there's a big push in that case for reconsideration of their sentence. They were sentenced to life without parole, an actual life without parole. And now there are efforts, and they look like they might even be successful, to have that changed so that they will see the outside of a prison. And then you've got this case where 30 years later, a person entitled to parole, and everybody's saying, why in the world are we even talking about this? It's offensive to me that we're even considering whether or not someone can see the outside of a prison when they've committed a crime like that. But what do you guys think? Do you think Susan Smith should ever be able to earn the ability to see the outside of a prison, or no? Please let us know in the comments. Before we dive into the other cases making headlines this week, I wanted to ask one very small favor from you, and that is, if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel now. We are thrilled by the response that we have had from all of you. We look forward to continuing to provide you with even more content each week, and the best way to do that is through your support. And don't forget to check out Courtroom Confidential, the podcast. Join our community on all major podcast platforms. Also making headlines this week, the death penalty will remain a possibility for a man charged with murder in the stabbing deaths of 4 University of Idaho students, a judge ruled Wednesday. Judge Stephen Hippler was not swayed by legal arguments made by Brian Kohberger's defense team to remove the death penalty as an option if he is convicted in the case. Kohberger is accused of the November 13th, 2022 killings of Ethan Chapin, Zaina Kernodle, Madison Mogan, and Kaylee Gonzalez. Investigators said they had linked Kohberger, then a graduate student at nearby Washington State University, to the crime from DNA found on a knife sheath at the scene, surveillance videos, and cell phone data. Kohberger's attorneys had argued in part that the death penalty does not fit today's standard of decency, that it is cruel to make condemned inmates sit for decades awaiting execution, and that it violates an international treaty prohibiting the torture of prisoners. Prosecutors argued that the Idaho Supreme Court had already considered many of those arguments in other capital cases and allowed the death penalty to stand. Trial is scheduled to begin next August and is expected to last up to 3 months. A verdict has been reached in the trial of Chloe Driver, a mother from Cherokee County, Georgia, who is accused of stabbing her toddler to death in December of 2020. The jury took less than 3 hours before finding the 24-year-old guilty but mentally ill of murdering 13-month-old Hannah Nicole Driver. According to prosecutors, Driver had been believed to be part of a cult traveling from North Carolina to Florida. During a stop at a home in Canton, officials said Driver took a knife from the kitchen, locked herself in a bedroom with her daughter, and stabbed her before stabbing herself. The verdict of guilty but mentally ill means that the jury rejected Driver's insanity plea and found her criminally responsible for her actions. She's set to be sentenced on December 12th. A babysitter in Hawaii has been found guilty of manslaughter in the 2019 death of a 7-month-old baby girl. Dixie Denise Villa was charged in July 2019 after an autopsy report showed that 7-month-old Abigail Lobish, who was found dead at Villa's home on February 24, 2019, died of Benadryl toxicity. During the trial, defense attorneys argued that others, including Abigail's mother and father, could have given Benadryl to Abigail, or that her mother could have had the drug in her system from taking Tylenol and then breastfeeding Abigail. But prosecutors countered that Villa was the only person capable of administering the drug and argued she was overwhelmed at having to look after 3 other children at the same time and had pacified the older kids with iPads and Abigail with the drug. Villa's conviction carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. A Florida businessman already charged with kidnapping his estranged wife in Spain is now facing new U.S. charges that he killed her. On Wednesday, a federal grand jury in Florida charged David Knezevich in a superseding indictment with kidnapping resulting in death, foreign domestic violence resulting in death, and foreign murder of a U.S. national. If convicted, he faces the possibility of the death penalty. Last June, Knezevich pleaded not guilty to kidnapping his 40-year-old wife, Anna Hideo Knezevich, who went missing in a case that has drawn international media attention. Anna Knezevich disappeared from her Madrid apartment on February 2nd, 5 weeks after she moved there. Her body still has not been found. A man in a motorcycle helmet was seen sneaking into her Madrid apartment building and disabling a security camera by spray painting its lens. The man was later seen wheeling out a suitcase. The couple was in the middle of a contentious divorce while fighting over millions of dollars in properties at the time of her disappearance. They have been married for 13 years. For more in-depth coverage of this case, please check out our Case Notes episode linked in the description below. The Illinois Supreme Court overturned actor Jussie Smollett's conviction on Thursday for charges that he staged a racist and homophobic attack against himself in downtown Chicago in 2019 and lied to police. The state's highest court ruled that a special prosecutor should not have been allowed to intervene after the Cook County state's attorneys initially dropped charges against Smollett in exchange for forfeiting his $10,000 bond and conducting community service. Smollett, who is black and gay, claimed 2 men assaulted him, spouted racial and homophobic slurs, and tossed a noose around his neck, leading to a massive search for suspects by Chicago police detectives and kicking up an international uproar. Smollett's attorneys have argued that the case was over when the Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox's office dropped an initial 16 counts of disorderly conduct. A grand jury restored the charges after a special prosecutor took the case. A jury convicted Smollett of 5 counts of disorderly conduct in 2021. He was sentenced to 150 days in jail, 6 of which he served before he was freed pending appeal, plus 30 months of probation in order to pay nearly $130,000 in restitution. 46 years after a double homicide case in Western Massachusetts went cold, an unexpected tip has led to an arrest. Authorities charged 71-year-old Timothy Joley with 2 counts of murder in connection to the 1978 deaths of Teresa Marceau, 18, and Mark Harnish, 20. Marceau and Harnish were last seen leaving a friend's party in the early hours of November 17, 1978. 2 days later, a police officer found Harnish's green Dodge pickup truck parked at a rest stop in West Springfield. The window on the driver's side was damaged and there was blood in and around the vehicle. The officer found the 2 victims' remains over a guardrail not far from the truck. Both victims had died of multiple gunshot wounds. Investigators at the time found a fingerprint on the passenger vent window of the pickup truck that did not belong to Morceau or Harnish. At the time, it was manually compared to around 70,000 known fingerprints. A break in the case came in October when Hampton County District Attorney's Office received a call naming Joley as a potential person of interest. Investigators obtained a fingerprint identification card for Joley, and comparative analysis verified his fingerprint matched the one recovered from the murder site. Joley had been living in Florida. He will be extradited to Massachusetts in the coming weeks. Before we get to what's on the docket for next week, I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for your support. We are completely blown away by the love of our growing community. But we want to take a moment to give a special shout out to Hot Rod and Dolce for their glowing review on Apple Podcasts, and to our new members, Cooler by the Lake 30 and Susie Bug 88 for their kind words on YouTube. Keep them coming, folks. We highly appreciate your feedback. On the docket for next week, Missouri man Andrew Lester will be back in court on November 26 for a follow-up mental evaluation to determine if he can stand trial for murder. Lester shot 16-year-old Ralph Yarl multiple times on the night of April 13, 2023, after Yarl mistakenly went to the wrong home to pick up his siblings. And finally, we would like to announce the newest installment in our Courtroom Confidential Conversation series with our interview of Bob Motta of the popular podcast and YouTube channel Defense Diaries. Please join us in the chat for the premiere at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern this coming Monday. That's it for us this week, folks. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. Thank you again for joining me. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you again next week for another episode of Courtroom Confidential.